This is episode 34 of the Shame Proof Your Life podcast, the one where I talk about losing a kid. I'm your host and life coach, Danita Bremer. Have you ever received a prompting that you ignored for a long time, like 17 years? This podcast is that for me. I'm telling my stories, I'm learning from my past, and my intention is that you learn to feel self-acceptance despite your shame and hope for a future where you can feel safe being yourself with your people. Okay, so one topic that kind of weaves itself in and out of my stories, but I haven't addressed it specifically, is the topic of parenting. And I have a specific story that honestly, I don't really remember that much, but I have a lot of shame around it. I'm not going to tell that one today, maybe next week. But as I was thinking about stories about parenting and feeling shame, two stories came up where I lost a kid. So I have three kids, two girls and a boy, and I have lost two of my kids, my oldest daughter and my son. And my middle daughter, it's really funny because her kind of, I don't know, her trauma always, I don't know if it's really trauma, but she always feels like we don't listen to her, we don't see her, we forget her. And it is true that there have been a couple of times that she's had to wait at, like, for example, piano lessons because I forgot to pick her up. But I do that with my other kids too, right? So it's kind of funny that she's the one that always says, "You always forget me," but she's the only one that hasn't been lost. So I kind of laugh about that. But I have on two occasions lost a kid, like legitimately did not know where my kid was and started to panic. So the first one was my oldest daughter. I think she was probably 8 or 9 years old at the time. And we have a park near our house. You walk through a green belt for about 10 minutes, and there's a park with, play structure and ball fields and a big parking lot. At the end of the parking lot is a rec center. And so in the summertime, often this park gets very busy. So one day we went to the park and I had all three kids with me. It had to have been not a non-weekend day, a Monday through Friday day, because my husband wasn't with me. And there were baseball games going on. Like, there are a few different fields at this park. And I think there were a couple different games. So there were a lot of people at the park, a lot of kids playing on the play structure. And if my oldest was 7 or 8 years old, then my other two were 4 or 5 and 3 or 4. So I've got like a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, and like an 8-year-old. And so I'm, trying to be mom to three kids at the same time. And of course, they don't ever all want to swing on the swings at the same time or all want to go down the slide at the same time. So, there's a lot of people at the park, a lot of kids playing on the play structure, and I'm swinging one while I'm watching the other one climb and go down the slide. And, so you do this thing as a mom where you're like, okay, 1 kid, 2 kid, 3 kid, and you're continuously 1 kid, 2 kid, 3 kid. And so I distinctly remember that one of my kids, I was pushing them in the swing and the other was on the play structure. And then I went to find my oldest and I couldn't find her. And so I took the one kid, I don't remember if it was my daughter or my son, out of the swing. And I said, "We need to go find your sister." So I'm having the kid like help look for your sister. And we look around, like, because I thought maybe she was on the opposite side of the play structure from me. Look around. She's not there. She's not anywhere near the play structure. There's this little grassy slope. I look, maybe she kind of wanted, I don't know what kids do, right? They have weird ideas. I'm not seeing her anywhere. And then the panic starts to rise. And I'm like, oh no, she is not here. So then I thought, well, wait, calm down. Maybe she went to the bathroom, which would have been really weird because most of the time my kids would say, "Mom, I need to go to the bathroom," and say, "Okay, go to the bathroom." And so I went and I checked in the bathroom. She wasn't in the bathroom. I'm like constantly scanning, right? So at this point, I have one kid on my hip and one kid on my hand. I'm like, we got to find your sister. And so I'm looking, I'm like, I've gone through all the play structures several times. I've looked here, I've looked there, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's gone. I don't know where she is. And I start thinking about, what do I do? Do I call my husband first or do I call the police first? That is where my brain went. And I'm like trying to hold in the panic. And then I keep walking down the path that goes past this play structure at the park. And there are places where they have bleachers for people watching the baseball games. And so I keep walking and I'm looking at all the people, looking at all the crowds, looking for my daughter, and my palms are getting sweaty. And I come around this big pine tree and there she is, sitting on the bleachers watching the baseball game. Now, when she was older, she might have actually been younger than 7 or 8. She might have been 5 or 6 or 7. I don't know, somewhere in there, because she actually played softball starting, I think, when she was 9 years old. She played softball for a few seasons, but at this point, we had never like sat down to watch a baseball game. I mean, Dad watches baseball on TV or whatever, but it was like, I wasn't expecting her to be there because it wasn't ever something we had done. And so I went up to her on the bleachers and I went, oh my gosh, there you are. You scared me. I didn't know where you were. And she was like, oh, mommy, I'm right here. And to her, it was no big deal, right? But I was searching for her for probably about 10 minutes and getting to that place where like, okay, I need to call someone. I need to start getting some of these other parents helping me, right? Oh my gosh, like some of the worst dread and panic I have ever experienced in losing a kid, right? But it turned out fine. Take a deep breath. All right. I think it's time to go home now, right? After that, I don't want to stay at the park anymore. I want to go home. So there was that experience that I considered, like I legitimately didn't know where she was for about 10 minutes and started thinking that something had happened to her. Somebody had taken her. Like it was a really busy day at the park. And then there was an experience. This was in, I believe, 2014. We took a road trip. Our family is not big on road trips. We generally like to fly wherever we're going and not have to like be confined to the car forever and ever. But I get it that some of you out there love road trips. So this was sort of a first experience for us. We had done a road trip to South Dakota, but that was like one day of driving. So this road trip was, I think, 4 days of driving. We did like 4 to 5 hours each day, and then we would camp. So we could stretch and let the kids play. And, because it's about a 12, if I remember correctly, a 12 or 13-hour drive to the Grand Canyon. And my husband used to live in the Grand Canyon Village in summers between school. He had an aunt and uncle that lived there, and he would go visit them during the summer. And so he kind of wanted to show us around and all of that. And so when we got to the Grand Canyon Village, we camped at the campground in the little village there. And it's this giant campground. I don't know, probably like 100 or more, maybe a couple hundred camp spots. And we'd been there a couple of days. It was Sunday morning. So we got up and we made breakfast, and I sent the kids to the bathrooms, which were kind of far away from us. We weren't super close to a bathroom. So I sent all 3 kids together. And let me think, how old were they? I think my oldest was 11. And so my middle would have been 8. And my youngest would have been 6, if I'm doing the math right. I feel like he was younger than that. So maybe my math is wrong, but my youngest was around 5 years old, 5 or 6. And let me think. No, actually, I think this was in 2012, which he would have been 4. And that feels more correct to me. So we have a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And I send them all to the bathroom and I say, go wash your hands and go potty and then come back. And we're going to get in our church clothes and go to church. So it's still pretty early in the day. And while they're gone, I am cleaning up breakfast and I don't know. I think maybe I was getting changed into my church clothes. And so the bathroom wasn't super close, but it wasn't like terribly far away that I wouldn't have felt comfortable sending my kids. So a few minutes later, probably takes them like 2 minutes to walk there, 2 minutes to walk back, and like 3 or 4 minutes in the bathroom. So, 8 minutes or so later, my 2 girls come walking back and I'm like, where's your brother? And they're like, we don't know. He wasn't waiting for us outside of the bathroom and we didn't see him. We thought he walked back without us. And I was like, oh no. Okay, go back to the bathroom, go find him, go get him. He probably took a wrong turn or something. So they go back and then they come back again and they're like, Mom, we can't find him. So I start to get that little panic in my body and I'm like, oh no. And of course, mom brain starts going wild, like all the terrible things that could happen. Like, what if he fell and hit his head and he's like passed out somewhere? What if somebody kidnapped him? Right? Like all of these crazy things. But we really legitimately could not find him. We all went, looked around the bathroom, start calling his name. He's not responding. By this time, when we're starting to call his name, other campers are like, hey, did you lose someone? And we're like, yes, little boy. He's about 4 years old. This is the clothes he's wearing. And like, I'm really trying to hold in tears at this point, and I'm like trying to hold it together, but I am panicking. My husband gets in the car. He starts to drive around the campground, which, as I said, is like this giant campground, lots of little, turns and twists and ways to get lost. And he comes back and he's like, yeah, I can't find him. I don't know where he is. So he goes to find the park rangers to alert them. In the meantime, we have like all of our neighboring campers yelling my son's name and nobody's finding him. And I am like so panicked. I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody kidnapped my kid. Like that's the only explanation, right? This goes on for an hour. You guys, an hour. I did not know where my 4-year-old kid was. And I'm like crying. And oh my gosh, I'm just like, what do I do? What can I do? So like I'm praying, I'm crying, like my girls are like, oh my gosh, what's going on? We're walking around. Like, what else can you do but like continue to walk around and look for a 4-year-old, right? Finally, after about an hour, I don't remember how we hear it, but somebody finds him. And I think it was like an older kid or a teenager who found him and started following him. And my son is like, he hates talking to people. So he sees people start to follow him. So then he goes faster trying to get away from them. Finally, he sits down on a rock or something and somebody starts talking to him like, hey, are you lost? And he won't say anything to them. But we hear from the park ranger or whatever, like, we found him, we're bringing him back. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. Right. And finally, the park ranger truck comes back. They, open the door. He bounces out of the truck. I thought, this is my kid who's like pretty anxious and he doesn't like talking to strangers. He doesn't like new experiences. He's easily scared. He comes out of the truck and he's like smiling and has this big smile on his face. And I'm like hugging him tight, right? Like as you would expect when you've lost your kid and you found him again. And he's like, Mommy, guess what? And I'm like, what? And he's like, I got to drive in a truck with a gun in it. And I just start laughing through my tears, right? Because I'm kind of freaking out. I'm crying and I'm like, oh my gosh, where did you go? How did you get lost? And he's like, I don't know. what happened was this campground was one that had kind of like a main street, like a, 25 miles an hour, not like you could go very fast, but it had kind of a road that divided the entire campground into two halves. I could be remembering this incorrectly, but this is what my brain tells me. And so we were on one side of the road, and there was a whole other half of the campground on the other side. And somehow he left the bathroom before his sisters came out, and he went the wrong direction and he crossed this street. And both my husband and I were like, he wouldn't have crossed this street, right? Like he's young, but he would know not to cross the street. But he did. He crossed the street and he started wandering around the other side of the campground. And so we were busy checking our side and thinking like he wouldn't have crossed the street, and we were wrong. And so he crossed the street, and he figured out he was lost. And actually, even before this, we had taught our kids, because we've traveled quite a bit with them. We've gone to like Disneyland and things. And every time we tell them, if you get lost, stay where you are. Just sit down, stay where you are. And so they kind of know this rule, but of course we've never been lost. We've gone to Disneyland. We do the thing where we write our phone number on their arm so that if they get lost, they just stay where they are. And then if somebody finds them, they can call our number. And so he kind of knew this rule, like if you get lost, stay where you are. But the problem was that he didn't realize he was lost for quite a few minutes, right? Probably for like 20 or 30 minutes, he's wandering around this campground. And it's kind of interesting because he's the kid that normally would just like cry over every little thing, but I don't think he cried this time. He just was like scared and like on alert. And he says he remembers there was this girl who was on a bike or a scooter that was following him, and he was a little bit scared of her. But yeah, like he was not as distressed, because part of my distress as the mom was like, oh my gosh, he's probably freaking out. He's probably so scared. He doesn't know what to do. Right. But eventually he got to the point where he was like, oh, I just need to stay where I am. So that was kind of a tender mercy. But man, talk about like panic and fear and shame, like in the moment and like during and before. It's just fear. It's just pure fear. Like, what happened to my kid? What do I do? Right. And then after the fact, it's shame. Like, oh, I should have told him. I should have told him to wait for his sisters out of the bathroom, or I should have told him to go into the girls' bathroom with his sisters. He was one of those kids that always liked to go in the boys' bathroom. But one thing, as I'm reflecting on this story, I was thinking, like, do I still feel shame about this, or do I not feel shame about this anymore? I mean, obviously, this is several years ago now. And at first I was thinking, no, I don't feel shame about it anymore. But at the time, and probably for a couple of years afterward, I did feel shame. Like I felt like it was my fault in some way that I didn't say the thing that I should have said. Like I should have made something more obvious. And, but then I kind of thought, actually, I do feel like I feel a little bit of shame, because when I think about this story, I feel that kind of like pit in my stomach. So I know because there are still sensations going on as I tell the story, and it doesn't just feel like I'm telling you a story about something that happened in the past. I think that there's still some shame around it. Like I should have prepared my kid, or should have done something differently. And one thing I thought of is that in this kind of situation, shame actually can serve a purpose. It doesn't have to be shame in particular. It could be a different emotion like fear or regret or something like that. But it causes us to think about, what would I do differently in the future? Right. And that can be really valuable. So, especially with parenting and when we're trying to teach our kids, it's really effective to point out experiences that they have had in the past, right? So like remember that time when we lost you, you were lost for like an hour and the park ranger had to come pick you up and take you back to us. They remember, right? They might not remember all the details, but they remember how they felt. So it's like, yeah, let's not do that. So I'm going to, put my phone number on your arm or whatever, right? So one thing I always do when we're at amusement parks or places that are really crowded is write the phone number on my kid, but also take a picture of them. Because if you ever have to call the police and if your child is legitimately lost, like nobody can find them, it's really useful to know what clothes they're wearing and what they look like what is their haircut today. And sometimes like we have tons of pictures of our kids, but we don't always have pictures of what they're wearing today or what their hairstyle is today. Like you might have just cut their hair or their hair might have grown out from the last time you took a picture that is a really good picture of their face. And of course, it reminds us to talk to our kids like, hey, this is a crowded place. Stay close to me. But if you get lost, just stop and wait. We will come find you. Right. And so it does serve a purpose in some ways of feeling that feeling of shame or whatever that feeling is for you. I wanted to tell another really quick little story about sometimes we have experiences with our kids that after the fact, we're like, oh, I didn't know I needed to make that clear. Like, I didn't know I needed to make it clear to wait for your sisters after you go to the bathroom, right? When we moved to Germany and we moved into our house that we had there, I was doing laundry and it had been a couple of weeks. I gather everybody's laundry, I'm doing laundry. And I think I was folding laundry and I was like, I've got like 5 or 6 outfits from my son, but there's no underwear. And I'm like, that's weird. Like, where is his dirty underwear? So when he comes home from school, and at the time he was 8 years old, second grade, he comes home from school one day and I'm like, hey buddy, I did your laundry, but I don't see any dirty underwear. Like, do you have it in a different place? And he's like, oh, well, I just take a shower and then put on my underwear that I was wearing before. And it's kind of like one of those smack your head moments where you're like, oh, okay. So I need to remind my 8-year-old that when we take a shower, we put on clean underwear, right? And it's just kind of one of those funny stories, but it does remind us as parents that sometimes things that are very obvious to us are not so obvious to our kids. And so there is my first parenting story for you where I do still a little bit feel some shame, but mostly I can let go of it and just be like, you know what? People make mistakes, things happen, accidents happen. This is just life, right? Like sometimes kids get lost or forgotten, right? And I'm not a perfect mom. I never intended to give you the impression that I'm a perfect mom, right? So I do remind my kids of that often, that I'm not perfect. And one thing I love to tell, especially my oldest, who is 17 and a half, I love to tell her, this is the first time I've had a 17-year-old. So little grace for me, little grace for you. Okay, I think that's enough for now. And of course, so are you. I would love to connect with you. I have some new things coming and I think you'll want to be connected. I would love for you to join my email list. I will drop a link in the show notes. And in my email list, this is where I kind of send some extra encouragement. And it is also the most reliable way to be in touch with me. So until next time, go be you and follow the spirit.